Hi everybody, welcome back to my kitchen. It is another day and time for another step in the fairly laborious process of recreating the ancient Egyptian temple incense, known variously as Kyphi, Kapet, or Kupar, which if we have the little subtitles going, it's always fun to see exactly what the subtitles make of those words. So today is uh, the day where we're going to use cinnamon, which is one of the next ingredients, and the mystery ingredient pekar, um, usually spelled P-E-K-E-R in the transliterations. Now, this is something that appears expressly in the Edfu recipe. The recipe I'm mainly working from appears on the walls of the laboratory room in the Temple of Edfu in Egypt. That recipe is over 2,000 years old. It's not the oldest recipe we have for Kyphi, but it is the only recipe we have that has really clear measurements, which is very important, and also the order in which those ingredients go together. The kicker is we don't have solid translations for some of the ingredients. Like there's a word there, and enough time has passed that we're not quite sure what it is. There's a lot of debate among scholarly circles and herbalists and everybody else and amateur folk like me on exactly what this mystery ingredient is. I mean, cinnamon's pretty obvious. The only thing you got to worry about with cinnamon is on our market. Actually, we'll grab a couple of things from Penzi Spices. I've got Indonesian cinnamon, Chinese cinnamon, Vietnamese cinnamon. There's another blend in there that is like grandma's homemade cinnamon toast. So the cinnamon that we get in on our market here, most of what we're familiar with is actually not true cinnamon. It's cassia because it's a little cheaper. It's a similar and related thing. It has that sort of like warm, spicy scent, but it's not true cinnamon. If you've ever had the old-fashioned candies Red Hots, that's super sweet, super intense, very like burn the roof of your mouth intensity, that's true cinnamon. And it is rarer, more expensive, and all of these are often blends, so that you'll get a little bit of true cinnamon in there, but you'll also get a lot of cassia. And specifically for this particular incense, although you could go to the grocery store and grab whatever ground cinnamon was on the shelves and use it. You could use it very effectively. Since the purpose of this exercise, this laborious, kind of ridiculously expensive exercise, is to make it as authentic as possible, true cinnamon was what I had to pick up. So true cinnamon is, I got the one that was chipped as opposed to just like rolls and things because I knew I was going to have to grind it and I didn't feel like doing what I have been doing with hunks of sycamore wood
it has
for
been
a while.
A process.
Yeah. So pick care. In the recipe, the different ingredients are separated into types. So like the resins are sort of all together, and there's, if you're familiar, or honestly, if you're not familiar with the ancient Egyptian language, beyond the fact that it's written in hieroglyphs, so they're little pictures, and in the oldest versions of the Egyptian language, those pictures are pretty clear. Like a picture of a tree that looks like a maple tree is pretty much the word for maple tree. As the language goes on, it stops being that simple. And of course, as things get more complicated and you have to have abstracts and everything, it's still hieroglyphic, which means at its most complicated, it's still not necessarily letters, so much of it's a syllabary. That gets into some complicated things with linguistics that I think I don't want to tangent on too much. But the long and the short of it is the word for something in ancient Egyptian has symbols in that, pictures in that, that give you an idea of what it is. They're called determinatives. And so, like, if they're talking about a tree, one of the last symbols is a symbol of a tree to say this word is a word for a thing that is a tree. And this word is a word for a thing that is a resin that comes from stuff. So they've got a bunch of different things to give you the idea of like, okay, so we can narrow it down to a tree. We can narrow it down to a seed. And beyond that, we have to kind of go digging around through things. In the case of Peker, it's under herbs. A whole bunch of things are under herbs. We've got things that are roots and things that are rhizomes, things that are grass and things that are seeds and berries, as well as nuts, all under the same heading. And so it kind of doesn't narrow it down too much for us. There's a number of pretty big names in Egyptology when it comes to language. If you casually go popping around on the internet and you look for someone who has an Egyptian dictionary on hieroglyphs, the most common name you're going to run across is Budge. A.E. Wallace Budge was very much a man of his time. He's from Victorian England. He was, you know, white Victorian dude. He did a lot for Egyptology. He was really the little engine that could. There's a lot of stuff that wouldn't have survived without him. However, he had a very white colonial attitude toward it. There's a lot of stuff that got smuggled out of Egypt and, you know, pillaged and raided from tombs and bargained for at the bazaar. And he, well, to put it bluntly, when he couldn't figure out what something said, he kind of made shit up. And he has some pretty broad and loose interpretations. And Egyptology, in a lot of ways, has been recovering from the good he did with all of the fuck-ups that he also did. Better people, Faulkner, spelled just like the American writer, but he's a different fellow, is probably, if you can find his dictionaries, if you're really curious about looking this up, his stuff, but it's super scholarly, and you're going to kind of have your eyes crossed going through it because it's most of his dictionaries. Like one thing that's useful with Budge is you still get to see the original hieroglyphs, and then you see the transliteration of what they think that word was pronounced like, and then you get the idea of like what we think that word was. Yeah.
So there's a question. How did you even think to start making Kyphi?
Oh,
like, what prompted this?
Okay, what prompted this entire obsessive process? Last year, I think it was a conversation in December of 2018, actually. I was working with one of my students, a very good friend and artist, Kat Mason Rogers. She's the one who does the energy body readings. If you've seen some of the stuff that I've talked about, she processes a lot of her inner work, psychic stuff. She's an incredible psychic and medium. She also has a graphic arts degree. So she can make, she's a fantastic artist. She has the unique confluence of being able to take stuff from inside her head and put them on paper in a way that is amazing and engaging, and you know, her infographics are not to be rivaled, and also has the vision to perceive stuff. So we were talking about past lives. In my tradition, in House Kepru, we work with past lives a lot. There are pretty much two things to be part of House Kepru that you kind of have to believe in. I don't usually ask people to believe in anything, but these are so integral to our system and our work. You have to believe that energy exists, that there is some sort of vital energy that we work with, and that's, you know, it's kind of the force, like it's in you, it surrounds you, like it's got a lot to do with how psychic abilities work and how we heal and how lots of stuff happens. And that's, I'm doing a whole class on that, in fact. And then reincarnation. And while I don't require people to take past lives as 100% literal fact, it is important to our system to go digging around for the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we carry about who we might have been in the past. How you interpret what that means is up to each person, but everybody has almost everybody has something that they carry that kind of has been around with them like their whole lives, and it doesn't seem like it started here and now. And it may be only a hunch, a feeling, uh, things that drive them to explore certain things. And for a certain subset of people, there are some people where there are vivid recollections, incredibly vivid. And the hard part about that is most past life memories, uh, they don't stand out when, you were a farmer for the 157th time. And it's just the same thing day in and day out. The stuff that stands out, the stuff that you carry with you that like screams in your head is almost always wrapped around strong emotion. Frequently trauma. So a lot of what we do as part of our shadow work is just a fancy way of saying going around inside the parts of your brain that you don't pay a whole lot of attention to, and maybe you've shoved them in a corner and you don't want to look at them too much. The stuff that bothers you, the stuff that you kind of prefer not to deal with. Shadow work is pulling all that out, looking at it, going, what does this actually mean? Does it serve me? Is it useful? If I understand it now and I put it back, can I make conscious choices about how it affects me and how it manifests in my behavior? Okay, shadow work is bringing those dark things into consciousness so that you can make better choices about how you behave, what choices you make in your life, how you interact with people around you, how you feel. So past life work is a part of that. Anyway, so that's a very, very long discursive way of saying back in December of 2018, we were talking about past life work and the use of scent as a memory trigger. Oh God, if anybody is as old as me or older and remembers Omni magazine, there was an experiment they did in the 80s with regards to scent and memory. And so there was an issue of the magazine that came through, and in the magazine were like a whole bunch of these scented little like black things, and you opened them up, they had no indication of like what this was, and you smelled it and you filled out a form about like what it reminded you of. From psychology, we know scent is a profound memory trigger just for this life stuff. So the idea was, how big of a memory trigger is scent for past lives? Several of us have definitely had experiences where a scent triggered a past life, where there's something in the way the lightning smells on the air at a storm over a certain type of meadow, and suddenly you're kind of somewhere else, and it feels like down to your core, like something that you've seen before and experienced before, and that immediate visceral sensory experience kind of serves as a bridge to the rest of the content of that memory. So we were so a bunch of us have memories where we think we were serving in temples, we were connected to a temple system. That temple system seems to have roots in the ancient world, and there's definitely some ties to Egypt and the surrounding areas. So what if we recreate an incense that was used back then, something that was explicitly used back then? And so my rabbit hole began. I'd heard about Kyphi before, to the point where I've heard it pronounced 80 billion different ways. So Kyphi, Kyphi, pick it. It's a little bit like my last name, Belanger, Bellinger. It really depends on the region and who's saying it, and people in my family all pronounce it differently based on like stuff. So like my aunt Kathy, who was a New York fashion model on Cosmo, she went with Belanger because it was easier for everybody to pronounce in the 70s. Anyhow, so that started my rabbit hole. That rabbit hole goes deep, and I ended up, finding references to the recipes at Edfu in that Lise Manish book that I had recommended. I think when the series is over, I'm going to collect my bibliography, put it up in links, with the caveat that a lot of these are out of print. Like the Lise Manish book, Sacred Luxuries, I believe was the title of it, is it's like $75 up on Barnes and Noble. I think it's similar in Abe Books. Like it's going to be between 70 and 80. It's out of print, so it's all older copies that you're picking up. But it's a lovely, lush book. So you've got recipes that survived on the walls of Edfu, two of them, in fact. You've got recipes that are from the 12th century BCE in something called Papyrus Harris I that is kept in the British Museum. And that is a record of donations to the temple of different ingredients that went into the sacred incense. You've got the Ebers Papyrus, which was a medicinal text, because this particular incense, while it had a key role in the sacred worship of the temple, was burnt every night. It also had medicinal properties. It was also used in medicine. It was taken internally, used as a breath freshener, used for asthma, for breathing problems, and stomach problems. So, and let's see, there's other classical references. So this was still in use. The history of Egypt is very, very long, thousands of years long. And the parts of Egypt that we're probably most familiar with, Cleopatra, that's once the Greek world had started to kind of spill into their world. So Cleopatra was of the Ptolemaic dynasty. That dynasty had a lot of crisscross over. There's things with Alexander. Look it up. It's a whole series of presentations by itself. Short version is there had started to be a lot of cultural exchange between this ancient monolithic culture that had remained largely unchanged for thousands of years, and did a lot of trading with other cultures, but really didn't borrow much from them, which is unusual when it comes to trade. Like, you'll have language and slang. I mean, just think about the internet. Well, hell, how much Japanese has spilled into English at this point? How much English has spilled into other languages because our cultures talk with one another? More than you'd ever think. Egypt, for a very long time, resisted being influenced by the cultures with which it had contact. There's reasons for that. And by the time Cleopatra and the Ptolemies come along, there's a lot of stuff that's happening with Greek, Roman influence, other Middle Eastern influence, what are known as the Sea people, who were a Semitic people that came over, probably from the Jordan-Israel area, but we're not 100% sure. And they started to shift things and change things, and also borrow stuff. So you see the Kyphi recipes show up in Greek and Roman texts, the Greek and Roman magical papyri. This style of incense making gets adopted there. There is a Syrian manuscript, or at least a manuscript that's in Syriac, the language of Syria, that also has this recipe. So we know it started to spread. So it's a scent that was associated with Egypt and was spread around the ancient world.
So there was a question, if some of the translations were, made by white colonial types who did not necessarily know what the words they were translating meant. Has there been any comparison from culture to culture to make sure of what goes into Kyphi, or have there been any samples of ancient Kyphi found?
To my knowledge, no samples have been found. A lot of scholars, Manish is a really good example, have spent a lot of time like taking as many of the recipes as they could find and comparing them. Some of them, like the one that's in Syriac, there's one in Greek, and so you've got these words that we're a little bit more familiar with. And so comparison has definitely been made. And with all of those comparisons and studies, there's still a couple that people are like, not totally sure. Peker is one of the ones that a fair chunk of it is used. So like cinnamon, it's only going to be 3 tablespoons in this particular instance. But Peker or Pecker, who knows how to pronounce it, it's just Pecker. I'm a 14-year-old boy, so I'm just like her, Pecker. So I'm saying Peker to avoid being ridiculous. That I'm going to need 1/2 cup and 2 tablespoons. So basically 1/2 cup and 1/8 cup, because I'm taking a reduction of an enormous amount of stuff. And that was the how it came down. 2 tablespoons, by the way, is 1/2 of a 1/4 of a cup, 1/8. So anyhow, so it's a good chunk of stuff. Some of the theories on what it is, I have seen henna argued pretty convincingly by at least one scholar. I tried it, not sure what I think about it as the ingredient. It does give the Kyphi a very, very rich reddish brown color, as henna does, because it's also used as a hair dye. I have seen opium as a translation. Opium was used widely. Hashish, can't speak, is another suggestion for what it was. Uh, One of the things that's important to understand is although this was edible, the Egyptians' idea back then of what was non-toxic will be quite different from what our idea might be.
Oh, no.
I mean, given the fact that the Romans treated lead, powdered lead, as an honest to God spice to put on their food. So we have, cultures that have very different awareness and understanding of what some things are doing for us long term. But the idea of putting something in this that might have hallucinogenic or intoxicating properties is not beyond the realm of possibility. It may be a feature, not a flaw, especially because Kyphi was believed to open one up, throw wide the gates of the imagination. I think one of the Greeks reporting about it is like, it it is known to stir the imaginative function that makes humans sensitive to that realm of dreams and spirits. Highfalutin language to basically say it makes you see shit. In my research, and in trying to track down, like, what did the hieroglyphs look like for this particular thing? And I admit this is, unfortunately, it may be flimsy. Some of it's a little bit of a gut instinct too, because there are some symbolic things about it that fit. And some of it is also, as someone who's made incense for a while, at this point, the incense needs some sort of powdered wood. It needs a little bit more fiber to hold it together, because it's incredibly resiny, it's incredibly sticky. There's a ton of honey, there's this dried fruit, and in the same way that if you don't put enough flour in a cake, you end up with mush. Without a little bit of mass of material that is more wood, and certainly more than 3 tablespoons of cinnamon, it needs something like that. So based on that, and then first based on that, I was like, I think it's a wood. A lot of modern people put sandalwood in their Kyphi, but in none of the recipes from the ancient world is sandalwood even mentioned. Neither is aloes wood, which was another popular one and incredibly rare. So here's this thing, and the only reason I'm like, might be right, might not be right. The dictionary I am working from comes from who? Budge.
Budge.
So questionable scholarship, but the thing is he was as right as often as he was wrong. It's just, there is a word pecker that shows up in there. It is a wood, it's a plant. So I'm like, okay, I'm not just like Google whacking something that looks like pecker. So this is a plant. We know it's associated with Osiris, which we know Kyphi is associated with reconstituting the body of that god. All right, so we're going pretty good. And it's associated with, it seems to be the sycamore tree, not the sycamores that we would find here in the United States, but the sycamore fig, which is a type of ficus. It's very, very special and unique and sacred to the culture of ancient Egypt and to, honestly, the Middle East in general. And honestly, it's also a tree. It's one of the few trees that appears by name in the Bible. So it is a tree that has a lot of deep religious and spiritual connotations, symbolism, and it was just kind of this amazing thing. Like, if you look up the sycamore fig and some of the stories about it, this is the decision that I made. Now, finding the wood for it was a completely different thing. It doesn't grow in the United States, and it doesn't reproduce without the assistance of a symbiotic wasp.
Oh, that's that one.
That's that one.
Okay.
So it's most of the ones that grow throughout the Middle East now only grow from like clippings from other trees. They're all asexual. They can't reproduce.
Wow.
They live for thousands of years, reportedly. Like the one that's in Egypt that was associated with Isis/Hathor, that's now associated with the Virgin Mary, is probably goes back to the culture of ancient Egypt. It's that old.
Wow.
Right?
That's an amazing tree. New pilgrimage idea.
So synchronicity being what it is, there were a number of synchronicities with this whole project. So from a random conversation of like, hey, I wonder what it would be like to do a past life regression and use scent as a trigger to see what comes up, to, hey, there's this ancient incense, it's really cool. Oh shit, it's expensive to make, but let's go down the rabbit hole. I started making orders to try to get this stuff. One of the possible ingredients in some of the later stuff is something called galbanum. And galbanum pretty much comes from Persia, Iraq, Iran. I managed to order my galbanum right before we shut down trade because there were sanctions and stuff going on. So I managed to get the stuff like just in the nick of time, like coincidentally, because I wasn't paying attention to like what kind of nonsense was going on with that. And the sycamore fig also ended up being a complete random series of events. Cat Mason's mom, Cat Mason Roger, because she got married. So if I just keep calling her Cat Mason, I knew her under her maiden name first. Her mom is an amazing wood carver. Actually, let me show you some stuff.
Don't worry, they're not too far away.
Her mom, brilliant. So I don't know how much this will come through here. Is it something I should show down here?
Yeah, let me make that
Okay.
screen bigger. Bring it to. Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
So you can kind of see that looks like a knight with his sword, right? And this is carved by her mom. But if you turn it this way,
it's a griffin.
It's a lion rampant. And this one is a dragon. But if you turn it this way, it's also a knight. And this is just some of the little, like, she just makes these because she's bored. Gave them away. She's just like, oh, those are nothing. So anyway, she had done a nice thing for me, and I wanted to, she refused to take payment for it, so I wanted to do something nice for her. And I figured, what better thing than send her some woodworking stuff? And into my email box came, because of course I was doing a Google search, and the algorithms being what they are, they're always paying attention to you, comes a company that does exactly that. And they were having a special with like these big packages for $99, just a ton of weird, exotic, strange woods. And I got curious what all was going in there. And I don't know, somewhere 5 pages into browsing, there's like a little note of like, they had sycamore fig wood. Because someone in California who they worked with had one, there'd been a storm. It had been knocked down, and rather than like, and so they parceled the wood up, and they were sending it off as like pen blanks and other things. So this is a pen blank. It's meant to be carved down into a pen of that particular, the sycamore fig. This one from California, but it's the same sort of thing. It has, as we were grinding it down with the Dremel earlier, it's got a warm sweetness to it. I hadn't ever really heard of sycamore fig as anything in incense. Like you hear about sandalwood all the time. And aloes wood, if you start to like really get into like the art of perfumery and incense making. But sycamore fig doesn't stand out as an incense.
So there's a question about whose job it was to make Kyphi. Could anyone make it, or was the task reserved for people in positions of power or authority?
It seems like it was so Kyphi making, at least from the temple of the complex, at least from the temple complex at Edfu, because it's multiple buildings. They had what's called the laboratory room. It is the room where all of the stuff was being made, not merely Kyphi, but like a lot of different things, medicines, incenses, etc. And all of the recipes are like right there on the walls of this great big vast thing. It seems like it was the job of priests, or at least people associated with the temple. I think the best way to to think back to the way this culture worked is, it wasn't just like one priest who lived in a little church or lived in a house near the church and he came to the church and did stuff. The temple was kind of like closer to a college campus. If all of the professors and all of the staff and the janitors and everyone all lived in the college and the surrounding buildings. So everybody who was involved with this temple lived there, worked there, did their stuff. So you had a lot of different jobs, and priests would do different things. So you had some priests who were representative of the gods, and they were the ones that did the offerings and did the performance of the rituals. But you also had people in the priesthood, in the priestly caste, who did other things as well. My best guess is people who were trained in this, and this was their area of expertise. This was also their way of worship. In reading one of the Greek writers, Plutarch, I believe, quoting Manetho, so it's like two things removed, they talk about watching Kyphi be made. And they're struck by how laborious a process it is, and also how with each ingredient, a bunch of other priests are standing around reciting hymns, reciting prayers. So the whole process was ritualized. So you've got, Joe Schmo priest who's there grinding all the stuff, probably 5 or 6 of them, because this is not a small task. And other people who are reciting prayers while they're grinding it, people who are taking it and adding it to the mix, probably a couple of experts who are overseeing this entire process, who, probably worked their way through the ranks, started in the paper room and, became editor, to borrow a thing from the publishing industry. And so they know all the nitty gritty of it, and now their expertise is shared by guiding everyone into the proper and expert way of putting this together. So almost certainly people associated with and dedicated to the temple. And it was probably a guarded secret. Also, why we have so many questions for like what really went in this. And once it gets to the Greek and Roman world, why this is a sort of storied, mysterious substance. And there's a lot of conjecture about like how was the proper way it was made. One of the downsides to mystery traditions that keep certain things mysterious and secret, is if anything ever happens to the keepers of those mysteries, they're lost. Family lineages, family traditions are like that. If it's only the nonas who are allowed to know how to throw the bones, and the nonas die before they teach, the next proper student for it, you lose entire generations of oral tradition. And those oral traditions do exist. They're dwindling for exactly that reason. We sometimes get so selective, we forget that if we don't pass on that exclusive knowledge, it's gone.
A really good follow-up question to that.
Mm-hmm.
How much do we know about ancient Egyptian spirituality or religion?
Oh, well, there's a lot written about it. There's a lot that's certainly recorded on temple walls and on the insides of coffins and in the stuff that has come back to or down to us and is known broadly as the Book of the Dead, which is probably better called the Book of Going Forth by Day. It's a manual for not just how to die, but like what to do as a spirit, like what comes next, and what you are supposed to do to make your afterlife the most ideal thing possible. That went through a fairly extensive, again, we're talking several thousands of years, this culture lasted. Initially, that manual, which tells us a lot about their beliefs, their gods, their goddesses, what they found important, how they believed the soul continued, how it embodied. First, that was reserved for the pharaohs only. And so it starts off written on tomb walls, and it ends up as coffin texts written inside the coffins. And ultimately, as it becomes a little bit more democratized, a little bit more available to the common folk, it's written on little papyrus, sometimes on pieces of jewelry, well, what we would think of as jewelry, like scarabs and things. And so it's broken up into like these individual spells, and you would pay a scribe to say Uncle Bob died, and you want Uncle Bob to have the best afterlife possible. Only you've got 50 coins as opposed to 1,000 coins. You go to the scribe and you pay as much as you can for maybe you get 3 of the spells written out for you to roll up in papyrus and to have mummified with him, to have put in the tomb with him as a kind of manual that he'd carry with him. I've always wondered how much the Egyptian Book of the Dead and that tradition has cognates in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, in the sense that here also is a manual for what the soul does as it discorporates and the journey it goes on after physical death has happened. And in the Tibetan tradition, in addition to like having this written down, people recite it to the person for a length of time, not just like as they lay dying, but after as well, because it's believed that the soul is still there for a while, that they can still hear and be guided along that process. And you say, hey, noble one, you may be experiencing this. Don't be afraid. Hey, noble one, here's this next thing. And I'd like to think, given how involved the ancient Egyptian funerary arts were, that probably during the extensive process of mummification for which that culture is known, some of the things that were done, in addition to all of the stuff done to preserve the body, because they're wrapping the mummy, and as things go on, like all of these amulets with pieces of protective magic and spells written into them, all of these pieces of stuff is wrapped right into the mummy, layers upon layers of it. It makes sense that that would have been recited, that these things would have been said, because the soul was believed to still be there. The soul, not quite the way we understood it, because the Egyptian soul had many parts. Again, that is a whole nother presentation. But we know a lot. And for as much as we know, there's a lot of things that we don't know and a lot of conjecture. And especially because Egypt was one of those cultures that was definitely being researched in the 1800s, when, let's just say that ethical guidelines for how best to conduct archaeological expeditions, retrieve the things in archaeological expeditions and interpret them. We didn't have they played it pretty hard. It was loose, very loosey goosey. We didn't have a whole lot of hard rules. We learned those in retrospect by screwing things up a lot.
So there's also a question about specifically what sort of rituals would you use this incense for? Is it only things related to past lives, or?
So this was used first and foremost as part of daily observance. It would be, I always confuse the first two. Frankincense and myrrh were the first two burned in the morning, and I believe it's myrrh first and frankincense at noon. And I might have those flipped because I keep being dyslexic about them. And then
mornings are hard.
Yeah, like I'm just not a morning person. Well, also because it, like, frankincense has a really solar scent to me, but I think, like, and so I'm like, would that be morning or would that be noon? Like,
Gotcha.
anyway, so frankincense and myrrh, morning, noon, night, and this Kyphi was burned at night. So it's part of the observance of the day, and it's part of sort of like closing the gates of the day and opening the gates of the night, which in ancient Egyptian mythology, the sun would make his journey through the sky during the day, and he would descend into the underworld for an equal number of hours at night. Burning the Kyphi in the temple that happens at the time when the sun is making that transition. So it is an incense of transitions, which kind of makes sense with its connection to also inspiring dreams, also inspiring visions and spirit communication. The references in the ancient manuscripts to its effect on the imagination and dreams in the ancient world, at least in Western civilization, dreams were where you communicated with spirits and with the gods. It's where you got messages. Um, Prophets in the Bible, although at this point we're so far away from the age of prophecy, we've sort of kind of forgotten it. I think because we have a very different attitude on dreams and dreaming now. But prophets in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, their prophecies, most of their visions came to them in dreams when they were communicating with God. It's not every single instance, but the vast majority of them have their experiences, have lengthy conversations in dream space. And that was normative for that culture. The one that stands out to me is a fragment that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran manuscripts, and it's the dream vision of Amram, who he is confronted by uh, the spirit who leads the sons of light and the spirit who leads the sons of darkness. And it's one of the places where we first see that Michael, is associated with being basically the general of the armies of the light. And Belial is associated with being the general of the armies of the darkness. But this is both seen as literal, as an actual communication, but it is also clearly a dream he has had. And he's communicating this dream to his children on his deathbed. And it's not the only one. The Book of Enoch, in order to talk to God, Enoch dreams, and to move it from just purely Jewish and to move it from purely Jewish and Christian tradition, Muhammad, like his entire experience, everything that inspires that religion, it's a dream vision. He goes on this fantastic journey through the heavens and all of that, and that's a dream vision. And it's perfectly normal for that to be something that came in dream and is real as well. So this something about this incense was believed to facilitate that sort of otherworldly communication, both to open those people present and smelling it up to that interaction, but also to sort of like make the walls thin and bring forth the things that would communicate with you. So lots of things, lots of cool things. And I'm going to actually do some grinding of stuff. So earlier, I spent a lot of time with the Dremel, and also this. Seriously, this has been my life.
A question to go along with that percussion. Have you found any evidence of musical accompaniment to making Kyphi, or is that more a thing that you've sort of intuited?
There almost certainly was. We have a lot of there's several instruments that come down. They're fairly simplistic. Many of them were associated with individual gods and goddesses, so sistrums, harps. It's probable in reciting the hymns that with this particular instance, it was what we think of as a cappella. There's a chance that there was a drum or a simple stringed instrument to kind of keep time and thrum, but it was probably a recitation. A little in the style, if you've ever heard recreations of like Homer's poetry with the Iliad and the Odyssey, where the performer would stand in the hall and the very language of the poem draws the picture. So in the words chosen, you can hear the pull of the bowstring and the twang of the bow and the of the arrow as it flies in one of the scenes. It's one of the most famous ones. So it's an amazing application of language, where language is not just the words and not just the meaning, but rhythm and percussion and sound and song, all of those mixed together. My sense is when they're talking about hymns being sung, it's going to be closer to that. I don't, like sistrums and cymbals and things are associated with a lot more celebratory dance. And we've got a lot of images on temple walls and on tomb walls especially that show that. But we know that they had harps, a couple of different stringed instruments, and obviously percussion, and the sistrums, which it looks like a rattle with like little cymbal bits on it, and it's made in the horns of the goddess, usually associated with the goddess. That's actually the reason I'm hesitant to say that the sistrum would have been played with this. Is I found no indication that this is associated with a goddess beyond Isis's connection to being the one who reconstituted Osiris. Most of the associations with this incense seem to have more of a tie to Osiris, who ends up being the god of the dead. So, Heker, 1/2 cup. And I'm going to be honest with you, I did not have enough of the thing that I needed. And so I have one of the other things that I've debated that it might be. And if you remember the kind of like interstitial batch that I made for Travel Channel, I experimented with that one with a little bit more of a wood, and I used cedar. Cedar was another sacred wood. It was another big import. The cedars of Lebanon were famous. So I got some wildcrafted cedar from Soapy Oaks Farm, who were kind enough to also have like this nifty little like gift bag of soaps for COVID-19 and all the stuff that they make from their goat's milk. And since this is coarse and only need 2 tablespoons, I'm going to put it in here, and I'm going to grind it with my true cinnamon. So this will be a variation, a bit of a divergence, can't talk, from the thing. And the cinnamon is 3 tablespoons. 1, 2, and 3. And now the kitchen smells like Red Hots.
Hooray!
And this is the 1/2 cup.
It's the ground sycamore thing?
Yeah.
Wow. It was a vial.
Oh, I had a bunch of it done in the garage.
Good.
Yeah, no, I did not.
I was gonna say.
No, but I didn't have enough. Like I was like, I can't, and I didn't. I was like, well, so I would have had enough, except last night, last evening, the neighbors texted to let me know that the German Shepherd next door, whom I adore or adored, was getting put to sleep today. So it sort of derailed my day, and I stopped many things to go deal with more important stuff, which was saying goodbye to a very dear friend. Social distancing style. So they brought him out into the yard. It was cold as fuck because it had just had like this freak snowstorm. And we put Remy in a harness because Remy adored Gunnar. They were best friends, and we would joke that they were boyfriends because they'd kiss noses and love on one another. I put Remy in his harness, and I let Remy hang out with his buddy. And we had a good conversation, me and the neighbor Kristen and her daughter, her eldest daughter, about just, death, life, what comes after, different beliefs.
You want to a question about cinnamon?
Sure.
All right. So if a ground cinnamon that folks can find in stores isn't real, what about stick cinnamon? Is that also
it varies. And the thing is it's the best way to tell is it, and there's different grades as well. It's not to say that it's not it's a type of cinnamon, and it's not the same type of cinnamon that they would have been using. So mostly it's cassia, or it's cut with cassia. If it is sweeter, more than it's like, if there's a sharp sweetness to it, it's probably true cinnamon. Most of the little, like you can get true cinnamon through a lot of like herb shops. Pretty sure you can find it on 6 shops on Etsy or Amazon. It is a little bit more expensive, but it is a different scent. Like the scent is noticeably different. Actually, Actually, I'm gonna make Illyria be my smeller of things.
Oh, how will I survive?
This is the Indonesian cinnamon. Okay, and smell that.
That smells really good.
Yeah, warm, sweet-ish. See?
That's so weird. That one smells more like plants.
Yeah.
Actually. I mean, maybe because it is plants.
Yeah.
It's
Well, I mean,
leaves.
So some of it is like kind of like where on the bark they're harvesting stuff. It's complicated growing stuff and harvesting stuff. But yeah, when possible, look for true cinnamon. And again, like this project that I'm doing is trying to be like as authentic as possible. While I'm doing this, I'd mentioned the recipe that was on the Papyrus Harris from the 12th century BCE. And it's probably one of the simplest, most straightforward recipes. The downside is it doesn't have measurements. But I'm going to try to make an easy Kyphi recipe that gets kind of like all the important stuff as well as the affordable stuff that you probably can find at any witchcraft or new age shop or herbalism shop anywhere, as opposed to this unwieldy monstrosity that frankly has a couple of ingredients that, like the gum mastic yesterday, that island's closed right now. Like, you can't get it. You might be able to find some little, because it's sold as a chewing gum through a couple of Middle Eastern stores, but even then, like, it's marked up and it's super expensive. And don't even try to get it from health food stores because the markup at that point is ridiculous. I went and there was like a little bottle of it, like ground up, and the bottle was, I think, $60 for it was less than an ounce. It was just a powder of this stuff. Like holy no. It's hard to get a hold of, but no. I mean, the one useful thing about gum mastic, which was part of stuff yesterday, is it's a tree resin. It's got a piney scent and flavor. It is definitely distinct from like pine resin or frankincense. It's somewhere in between the two. And it does have some qualities that seems to be unique to it. But in a pinch, if like your real goal is more matching the scent than like trying to just laboriously recreate something from 3,000 years ago, you can get away with just putting in a little bit, basically equal parts of pine and frankincense, and letting that be your replacement for mastic. You'll have essentially the same scent.
Is the molcajete there made of a specific material? Is it
volcanic stone?
Okay.
A lot of most mortar, they sell mortar and pestles and a bunch of different things. I have never enjoyed the sound that a metal mortar and pestle makes. It just drives me right up a tree. I usually use marble ones, but all the marble ones I had are a little bit too small, and some of the ingredients are just so much. And so I was looking for something that was big and chunky and had enough grit to it to just make it easier for some of these. And this fit the bill. Also, it was $20 at World Market on sale because I'm a sales hound.
So I've got a question. Was the list of ingredients that was posted a couple days ago, is that all the ingredients, or is that just the ingredients for this phase?
No, that's all of the ingredients.
Okay.
From what's known as Edfu 1. Edfu 2, pretty much the same ingredients and just slightly different measurements. So there were two versions of the recipe at Edfu alone. And that tells us that there were different ways to make it. like the Ebers papyrus that I've mentioned, which is a medicinal text, it leaves out a lot of the rare, like incense stuff, and it has more of the stuff that is purely medicinal. So it's the more costly, expensive stuff isn't in that recipe. It's more the things that seem to like do good things for you. The gum mastic, frankincense, myrrh, uh, the lemongrass, cinnamon wasn't in that one. Actually, I've got it here. Let me find it. Papyrus Ebers, the base of honey for the resins, frankincense, mastic, something called genin of the Nuban tree that they're just like, pine kernels, cyperus grass, those rhizomes that I was wrestling with, which you could grow. Like that's the thing. Is like right now, like so we don't use them as food here in the U.S. They use them in India. They use them in traditional Chinese medicine. They're available in Korea. But they're literally like the little like rhizomes that go to Cyperus rotundus, which is sedge. It's we kill it as a weed. It's a grass that gets into our grass, and it's not lawn enough. And so you could grow it feasibly and probably have a way easier time just harvesting the rhizomes that have not been dried to the point that they are hard as tiny little pea gravel. So pine kernels, cyperus grass, camel grass, which is lemongrass. This one also has inectune herb identified, and they're still kind of like, we don't know, can't tell. And oh, sorry, I lied. This one has cinnamon. So cinnamon does have a lot of neat medicinal qualities. Honey was, I love the hieroglyph for honey. Honey was used widely in ancient Egyptian medicine, as were many things that came from bees. And it has a lot of neat properties. Don't give it to babies and children, I think, under the age of 2, because it can have some bad stuff in it for them, because they're so tiny. It's in there for us, and we just don't react to it the same way. All right, that is, I think, as ground as some of this is going to get. Not quite as fine as the stuff that I dremeled, but we're just going to have to live with that. Now, because I have the luxury of doing so, this molcajete is used only for Kyphi and incense making. Like I haven't used it for anything else. So the only thing that's been in here so far have been ingredients that go into this.
Yeah, given that it's volcanic stone, it seems like it would be really hard to clean it if there was.
Yeah, and it's very pitted, very textured. It's just good practice with mortars and pestles and stuff. If you are making incense or you're making things, magic wise, have one for those and one for anything that you're going to use with culinary stuff. Not just to keep your magical tools separate, but also some of the stuff you might be using in spells or in incense are not as edible or safe as your food, and you don't want to get the two mixed up.
The question that I was wondering about.
Yeah.
Have you considered getting a sapling or cutting of the sycamore fig so you can eventually harvest the wood yourself?
I have, definitely. The downside is it's too cold here. It may not grow well. So I'm not sure if I will be able to do that. Now I have, someone a couple of days ago had mentioned that Egyptian mint was quite different from most other mints. It was milder, which was actually really neat to hear, because when I first saw that mint was one of the ingredients in several of these, I was like, but mint? Because I was thinking like peppermint and spearmint, like they're so sharp and it just didn't seem right. But there's apple mint, and there's a couple of mints that are much milder, and apparently Egyptian mint is like that. It's closest to apple mint, although it's from the mint family. It's a very, very mild mint. I actually kind of wonder, okay, they're talking apple mint and stuff. Is it mild like catnip,
Hmm.
which is also in the mint family, but it has a much, much milder. It's not that like sharp, like menthol right up your nose.
Oh.
Now, the mint that I was working with, because I was like, oh, I'm not going to be able to use any other stuff out of my backyard. Like all of the mint here is like so strong it's almost bitter. I got the mint from Crete, and it was a milder mint. So, I mean, there's so many varieties of mint, it's kind of ridiculous. All right.
Does that go in the
Oh,
big pot?
Yep, goes in the big pot.
I'll bring the big pot.
All right.
You ready for the big pot?
Yep, I am ready for the big pot. Let me move
right.
this out of the way.
Hoi.
Oh, that's heavy.
Big pot o'clock. I'm gonna grab a view here.
Pardon me for the noises this is going to make. All right. And we are at the point where it is going to need more wine. But first I'm going to just mix it up. So there's one more important ingredient that I held off for, and it is called sweet flag or calamus root. It's going to be the last of our dry ingredients before we get to honey and frankincense and myrrh, some resins that we treat very differently. Gum mastic and pine resin we just ground up and put in. Frankincense we're going to melt in honey. It's quite
delicious.
It is quite a production. Sweet flag, aka calamus root, is it's what's known as a fixative. It is used in perfumery to hold the scent and to draw out richer depths of scent. And when I add that last cup of wine, I'm going to take the powdered sweet flag that I purchased, and I'm going to mix it into the wine so that it is thoroughly mixed through everything, and then continue to mush my Kyphi batter.
Mush.
And for those who are new, why is this in this big, weird, fancy copper pot? There is a chemical reaction that the copper does, especially when the wine is in here, and particularly when we get to the point where we are heating this and boiling it down. Also, the copper conducts heat much more evenly, and that will be important as we boil this down and reduce it. Okay, so my first version of Kyphi I made not with raisins but with dates, and the thing that I notice in difference right off the bat with this is with the dates it was so super sticky from the get-go, because dates are really like very, very fibrous, very sticky. They were medjool dates, very high in sugar. There's date syrup that was used as a sweetener still throughout the Middle East. And this is a lot more like, it reminds me, if you've ever made scones, like the way,
The dry batter.
yeah, the dry batter, like it's very different. I started with dates as opposed to raisins because I had the idea, one of the manuscripts talks about cleaning your raisins, and it specifically describes cutting them open and taking out the pit and washing the inside, which sounds like a date, not like
Way
a
more
raisin,
than a raisin.
right? So I'm like, I'm skeptical. Like, are we translating it as raisin just because it's dried fruit?
Mhm.
Now the thing is they don't really have grapes in Egypt anymore. Um, Certainly not the way that they used to. It's not a region known for its winemaking. And yet, during ancient times, they had grapes. They had wine. They were known for their wine. It was rich and red and sweet, and it was used extensively in medicine and in other recipes in the temples. And right now, this doesn't smell like you would expect incense to smell. It just sort of smells sour.
Well, here's a question that I don't think we've actually considered.
Hmm.
Would it be possible to pre-order some of the Kyphi on your website?
Probably. I mean, well, first, I want to make sure it actually like turns into stuff that is going to be recognizably Kyphi. And we'll know when I'm done with this process. Like when I've done the
Cool.
boiling down and stuff,
Mhm.
we could feasibly go, okay, let's pre-order this, and
Yeah.
as soon as it's cured. And the thing is I'm going to estimate probably late September or early October. So for your birthday, the Kyphi might be ready.
What about the first batch?
I'd actually have to check the freezer. So when I made the first batch, uh, I hit my limit of sitting hunched over this, covering my fingers in benzoin dust and like hand rolling all these tiny little things, and then you're like arranging them like on platters everywhere in like the garage just looked like insanity. And I hit a point with it where I'm like, and I just started making Kyphi logs. They looked like big Tootsie Rolls, wrapping them in parchment paper and chucking them in the freezer. It had started at first to cool them down
Mhm.
so that they were easier to work with, in the same way that you work with dough. Um, I know that there's still a few of those in the freezer. The good and the bad thing is that by freezing them, they kept just fine. They didn't cure. So when they are cool again, it's just like I had just made them. So they still need to either be dusted, like, cut up into the little logs so people can individually pinch stuff off and roll it up, or hand rolled and then set out and cured.
Mhm.
I have also been using the original Kyphi as kind of the Kyphi equivalent of a sourdough starter. So for Haunted Salem Live, because I needed something that was a little bit more resin-based of an incense that would burn reliably directly on a charcoal, because I didn't think I could predict having access to the kind of bougie things you need to burn Kyphi on. So I used a chunk of the Kyphi, the original stuff, as the base, and then I upped the frankincense and the sycamore and the cedar, and made something that was a little denser, a little bit less fruit based. Like the fruit was still there, you still had the scent of it, but it burned a little bit more like the incense we're more accustomed to. And in reading, there's a set of manuscripts. They're called the Leiden Papyrus. They are related, at least tangentially, to the Greek and Roman magical papyri. They're around the same time period, so between 300 BCE and 300 AD, or CE. And there's a couple of instances where they describe incense that you use when you were doing spirit communication and some of these bold divinations. And what they were describing sounded just like you had the gooey mass, and you would take some of it off, and then you would add some more, you pound some more things into it to basically use it as a base, and then use from that base, add the things that would be unique for that particular spell or that particular spirit. And when I'm done with the Kyphi experiment, since a couple of those were very clear on what those ingredients were, I am going to play around with making a couple of them. My only hurdle right now is aloes wood is prohibitively expensive. Also known as oud wood.
It smells so good.
Oh, it's amazing. It's actually from a parasite or a fungus.
Really?
So it's a thing that infects a tree, and it's the wood that's infected, and it changes the smell.
Wow.
Reading up on this stuff, the number of our like precious incense ingredients that come from plants that have been tortured, stressed, or like nigh unto killed, and that's how they produce this stuff.
Very much, oh God, what's his name? Crowley.
Yeah, it's a little distressing to know that like the trees that give us gum mastic are everywhere, but it's the ones that are really sad because the island they grow on just isn't perfect for them anymore, and so they weep.
So even
and we gather their trees, we gather their tears, and we turn them into incense and medicine.
Even trees must suffer for art.
Yeah, I feel a little bit bad when I think about it like that.
Yeah, that's fair.
So some of these things are like the veal of the plant world. I do know, like a lot of these things don't grow over here in the States, but I believe that there is a fellow, right across from on Etsy, who's been from cuttings and things growing frankincense and a couple of the, sort of like storied incense bringing plants, which is probably good because with the New Age movement and with all of the like holistic plant medicine and stuff that's really kind of like grown up as an industry in the past 20, 30 years, we are harvesting this stuff to the point where we may run out. We may make these things go extinct. We are turning them into powders for our pedicures and face masks and like all these high-end bougie things. And for that industry, they're just not paying attention to the fact that it can take 3 decades for one of these plants, in some cases, to come to a level of maturity where it should even be considered to be harvested.
Here's a question. So we're on day 4 right now of making Kyphi. How many days does it take before it is?
So tomorrow will be day 5, and that's where it's going to be the last bit of wine, the sweet flag to fix everything, and then I set it aside for 5 more days.
So 5 days of making, 5 days of it setting and burbling away.
And now that number, different recipes had different length of time. So some of them said you added 1 ingredient each day over the course, and it could have as many as 18 ingredients. But several others referenced a week. And the thing is like that 10-day cycle, they had some of the oldest calendars weren't necessarily 7 days. So I'm going with a 10-day calendar. It had the closest match to the stages on several of the recipes. Now, some of that is just purely, I'll be honest, some of that's just pure intuition. This is an exercise for me also in, well, honestly, magic, past lives, and intuitive stuff. I won't make any pretension that I don't have ties to some of this stuff. It's been an interesting process to have like little flashbacks of not necessarily being the person grinding the stuff, but being the person kind of like standing behind them going, you're doing it wrong.
Makes me glad I'm not the one doing the grinding. Currently. Oh no, Kyphi lost.
Yeah, the other reason, tomorrow when I do the sweet flag, that is the one ingredient that is slightly toxic. And it's not so toxic to us that it's anything we would notice, but to a cat, and possibly to a dog, but specifically to a cat, it could be problematic, and it's a powder and it may get everywhere. So we may move to the garage to do that last and final step so that I don't have it where Bliss or Remy or
My baby.
or your baby Ozzy have any chance of accidentally snorting it and getting kidney or liver damage. Because it's a remote possibility, but I like to be safe with the fur babies. Already had one doggy funeral, don't need any more pet funerals. Thank you much.
Yeah.
So now we set it aside for another day. I am still covered in sycamore dust.
And you smell delicious. Or maybe that's just the sycamore dust. I don't know.
It could be the sycamore, could be that, and that mixing with the true cinnamon was pretty neat.
So there's a question about when you're in the process of making Kyphi, do you ever feel like you've gone into a trance or channeled any information, like tuned in the goodness?
Bliss thinks so. Yeah, I do a lot of memory work. So channeling for me acts a little bit differently. Most of what I have ever channeled is me. I mean, if you've seen me on the TV shows, I'll pick stuff up, and I usually try to be really clear that like there's a thing standing near me that's talking to me and I'm relaying it. And I've learned enough to like relay it in kind of like the way I'm feeling it, like the tone that they're presenting it in. But it's different from channeling. They're not speaking through me. I'm speaking for them and making a conscious decision to mimic the way in which they are passing it along. You saw that on Portals to Hell if you watched it with like kind of stepping into the preacher. I wasn't channeling, I was recreating what I was experiencing, what I could hear and feel in the space, which is a little bit different from true channeling where you become a mouthpiece. And it is a light, controlled, often consensual, possessory state. I have one time and one time only allowed a spirit to take me over, and he was a good friend who had died suddenly and unexpectedly, and he was supposed to be the person in charge of a large convention. Many of his students and friends, including his wife, were there, and he would have been leading the opening ritual, and I allowed him to lead that opening ritual through me, and that was a very weird experience. For me and for everybody else, I'll be honest. And I have those limits for a lot of reasons, but I mean, the simplest one, the cheeky one is, I'm a very big personality. There's only so much room.
Got another interesting question. To be fair, these may go farther and farther off topic because I did.
Yeah.
In fact, say that people could
that's fine. And
just open up.
Yeah, I'm cool with that.
So the question is, do you think that Kyprian castes can be used for non-vampire rituals?
Oh yeah. It's so in my system we have 3 castes or castes depending on how you want to pronounce it, and they are priest, warrior, counselor. If you've ever been to one of my kind of like more vanilla paranormal talks about energy, you've probably heard me talk about kind of directing types who perceive stuff up here, and more like empathic connecting types who like the energy is through here, and then more like your grounded sort of like gut feeling types and it's down here. Same thing. Those 3 things, although for us there's like some ties into this mythic narrative of serving as like literal social groups in a temple in different jobs, guardians, warriors, counselors who were everything from temple concubines to companions and assistants, and played a sort of priestessing role that was more supportive and nurturing than necessarily like up there and declaring at people. And priests who were more administrative or were like the high priest who was like, I am now the mouthpiece of the god running the ritual, and I look like the guy in charge, but really I am kind of the top of the pyramid and everybody else is holding me up so that I can do this job. They really are just 3 different steps along how energy work, and everybody could technically do these different types of energy work. Priest is the harnesser, the director, gives shape to it, imbues it with their will, mostly experiences psychic stuff through here. So it can either be hyper rational or hyper visionary. Either way, there's a lot of tie to the throat as well, because a lot of power comes through here. So it's voice and vision and will. And then for the counselor, it's more voice but heart. And then down here, so like holding and nurturing and generating. And then with warriors, it's stepped down even further, where it's will and gut, and then connection to the earth and all of the survival that goes with that, and the need to protect and the need to build boundaries and safe shelter. And in our modern culture, we tend to interpret that sort of warrior vibe as masculine. And we tend to interpret that counselor vibe as feminine, but they're not strictly male or female. It's more, what does our culture associate with these roles and these jobs? And then priest is honestly more androgyne, like kind of neither this nor that. You would think of it as, I don't want to say like above those, because that implies a valuation.
I have to throw this in there. Metrosexual?
Sure. but actually in some ways, like, concerned with stuff that, like, the body isn't a big deal. Like not concerned about the body. Sometimes to a point where they're just not attached to the body in functional ways, and they kind of need the warrior types to be like, dude, have you eaten today? And the counselor types to be like, so self-care would be really useful. How do you feel? Because you seem upset, and I think you're just ignoring it.
There's a question. Is it normal for warrior caste types to struggle with perceiving spirits?
Yes, especially because the way in which the society we find ourselves in right now, the way we present what is psychic is just all this stuff. It's what you see. You have pretty pictures in your head. You can describe them, and it sounds like you're having a movie play out, and sometimes you are. And that leads us to forget that empaths are also psychic. And you might not see a spirit or have a vision that is like clear, where you can get names and describe what a place looked like, but you know what it felt like. You know how it's connected. You feel it here. You process it on a different level. Warriors the same way. And this one is also like, it gets the shittiest end of the stick from our culture. Gut instinct, just walking into a space and knowing something's not right. Walking and knowing, that person's going to be a problem. I got to deal with that. That is no less psychic, simply because it's not processed here or here. It doesn't make for pretty shiny television shows, and yet it is absolutely psychic. And it doesn't mean that somebody who processes things like that can't develop the other abilities. And I'd argue, actually, the folks who like live up here all the time really should be working to also have some connection with being able to read emotion, being able to go, the building's on fire. Maybe I should stop this ritual. I could die. So the castes in our system exist to give you an idea of like, where do you start? What is your default? If you've had no training at all, how do you naturally process energy and your perceptions from the environment around you? Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? The hard part is if it's down here, you probably don't think of yourself as sensitive at all. You'll do stuff. Everybody benefits by having you around. You are the rock in almost every friend group. You are the person who, when you go to like a haunted place and everybody's doing their thing and shit goes sideways, you're the one who keeps your cool and gets everybody out safely. And that is an essential job. Not nearly as fun and flashy as this, but that person, me, is dead without that other counterpart, and is miserable without this one. So they're three parts of a whole.
I think one last question.
Yeah, one last question.
And then we'll
because
sign off for the night.
I need to get food
soon. We gotta feed you.
Yep. self-care.
Look at that. It's like we can do things together.
Uh-huh.
Oh.
Wonder Twin powers.
Activate!
You don't even know the cartoon I'm referencing, but
No,
that's
I
okay.
don't, but I knew what you were going to do. Okay, so the last question that I wanted to share with you from the chat is, how can a person overcome a fear of spirits?
I mean, fear is a tricky thing for a lot of people. Fear comes from a place of uncertainty, not knowing if something's dangerous and not knowing how to tell if something's dangerous. That's really, fear is a very natural response when you are in situations where something could hurt you. So the first way to overcome fear for anything is to become educated about it, is to learn about it. You're afraid of the dark, afraid of people, afraid of cats. You don't have to go right, let's say cats, it's silly. And maybe not silly. You don't have to rush right out and go get a kitten. Maybe you should just read a little bit about them, like learn, what do cats do? How do they behave? What are circumstances under which cats are actually dangerous? How do I avoid those circumstances? Same thing would happen. I would apply the same logic to overcoming a fear of spirits. Learn about them. Try to be open about that. Educate yourself as much as possible over what is actually dangerous and what's just unsettling because we're not quite sure what to expect. If you have spirits that you have to interact with, you have a house where maybe some stuff happens, tentatively, don't go in with the fear if you can help it. Certainly don't go in combative, because fear makes a lot of people react violently. When people are afraid of something, we want to smash it, we want to throw it out, we have a visceral reaction. It's us trying to protect ourselves, sort of proactively. Get away from me, just in case you're bad. We see that play out in so many hauntings. Allow for the possibility that the thing you're afraid of is actually not dangerous. And if it's never actually hurt you, if the only threat it has made has been the threat of existing, give it the benefit of the doubt that it might be fine, might not be dangerous at all, might actually just want to exist, maybe be left alone, maybe to communicate. So if you get yourself comfortable enough by researching, by understanding, by kind of setting yourself up with, like, this is how I would protect myself if it was dangerous, go talk to something. You don't have to invite it into your house. You don't have to invite it into your body. You don't have to do anything beyond, like, hey, I think I know you're here. Admit that you're afraid. Sometimes they don't realize that, and they are so eager to communicate that they get pushy. They get like over-eager Labrador puppies, and they're just jumping all over you, and you do get hurt sheerly by accident because they're so exuberant. Like, that happens.
Oh goodness, you can hear me? Let's talk for hours.
Yeah. So actually go, I'm a little scared of you. And when you do these things, if there are specific behaviors that you're really unsettled by, speak them out loud. You do not have to be a spirit medium for them to hear you. Different skills come into play for you to perceive them accurately, but they can hear you just fine. Whether they listen, another matter entirely, based on who you're dealing with. But the vast majority of spirits, especially human spirits, they're just like people, except they're not wearing their bodies anymore. And so they react in the same way that people do. They are emotional beings. They are beings that follow fairly logical psychology. If you are kind to them, if you are considerate to them, they will be the same back. If you tell them something they're doing bothers you, most of them will stop doing it or find some way of compromising. So educate, find what is your comfort zone, and then try to communicate, try to learn directly from the source. And that's actually the approach I would give you for anything, and especially any person you are ever afraid of, any group of people. We have a lot of fear in our culture about things that are different from us. Learn about it first through written sources, teachers, things like that. A couple of steps removed just for your comfort. Figure out what your boundaries are. Figure out why you're afraid. Like, really be honest with yourself about that. And then go directly to the source and start a dialogue.
Right. That's a wonderful place to end today's Kyphi and associated psychic topics broadcast. We'll catch you all tomorrow.
Bye.